The morning of October 25th, 1944, smelled like burning oil and seawater. Lieutenant Commander George Clements of Torpedo Squadron 80, VD-80, flying off the USS Ticonderoga, had already taken a 20mm cannon shell to the port wing root of his Grumman TBF Avenger. The hydraulic line to his torpedo bay doors was severed. His radio was producing nothing but static. His tail gunner, aviation machinist mate Second Class Roy Dempsey, had gone silent after the first pass over Leyte Gulf. Clements did not know if Dempsey was dead or simply stunned. What he knew was this. Somewhere beneath him, through a broken overcast at 4,000 feet, the Japanese destroyer Fujinami was running at 27 knots, attempting to flee the destruction that American air power had been raining on the Imperial Japanese Navy since dawn. And Clements was carrying one Mark 13 torpedo, armed, fused, and theoretically ready. In a bay whose doors he could no longer confirm were open, his aircraft was dying. His torpedo might be useless. His crew was down to one conscious man, besides himself. He pushed the nose over anyway. What happened in the next 40 seconds has never made it into the popular histories of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It does not appear in most accounts of the greatest naval battle ever fought, but it is documented in the strike reports of Carrier Air Wing 80, in the action summary of Task Force 38, and in the post-war interrogation records of Japanese naval survivors, as one of the most improbable single acts of destruction in the entire Pacific Air War. A crippled aircraft, an unarmed or possibly armed torpedo, a crew of questionable status, and one pilot who decided that dying was less important than finishing the job. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Clements was doing over Leyte Gulf on the morning of October 25th, 1944, you need to understand what that morning meant, not just to him, but to the entire strategic situation of the Pacific War. The American invasion of the Philippines had begun on October 20th, when General Douglas MacArthur's forces waited ashore at Leyte Island. MacArthur had promised to return. He returned. But the Imperial Japanese Navy had not surrendered the archipelago without a fight. In Tokyo, Admiral Soma Toyota activated Shogo 1, Operation Victory, the last coordinated offensive the Japanese fleet would ever attempt. The plan was staggeringly ambitious, given the state of Japan's naval power in the autumn of 1944. It called for 4 separate naval forces to converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions simultaneously, destroy the American amphibious fleet, and cut off MacArthur's invasion forces from their supply lines. If it worked, the Philippines would be held. If it worked, Japan might negotiate a peace from something other than total defeat. If it worked, it would be remembered as the greatest naval reversal of the war. It did not work, but it very nearly did. The reason it came so close, and the reason that Lieutenant Commander Clements found himself flying a dying aircraft over a fleeing Japanese destroyer, requires understanding the geography and the desperate confusion of those 4 days of battle. The Japanese had divided their strength into 3 principal striking forces. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded Center Force, 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers, the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still assemble. Kurita's orders were to transit the sea beyond sea, pass through the San Bernardino Strait, and fall on the American transports at Leyte Gulf from the north. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded the southern force, approaching the Surigao Strait, and Vice Admiral Disaburo Ozawa commanded a decoy force of aircraft carriers, nearly empty of planes, stripped of their air groups, designed to lure Admiral William Halsey's 3rd Fleet northward and away from Leyte Gulf entirely. Ozawa's decoy worked. Halsey took the bait. He took the bait completely, chasing the Japanese carrier force north with all his fast carriers and battleships, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Kurita's center force passed through in the night of October 24 to 25th and emerged into the Philippine Sea at dawn, heading south toward Leyte Gulf. What stood between Kurita and the American transports was Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was not a battle fleet. It was Task Unit 7743, a collection of 6 escort carriers, small, slow, converted merchant hulls, and 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts whose primary mission had been anti-submarine patrol and ground support for the troops ashore. They were armed with 5-inch guns and aircraft loaded with bombs designed to attack supply lines and troop concentrations, not the heaviest surface fleet Japan had fielded since Midway. When Kurita's battleships appeared over the northern horizon that morning, their pagoda-style superstructures rising from the sea like moving towers, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague of Taffy 3 had approximately 3 minutes to understand that his escort carriers were about to be engaged by the Yamato and the Nagato, by 8-inch gun cruisers, and by fleet destroyers traveling at speeds his own vessels could not match. Sprague ordered his destroyers to attack. The attacks were suicidal by any rational calculation. The destroyer Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans in command, made her first torpedo run against Kurita's cruisers while absorbing hits from shells that outweighed her own hull plating. She was eventually sunk by gunfire from 3 Japanese destroyers at close range. Evans killed at a station. The Hull and the Samuel B. Roberts were also sunk, but their attacks and the desperate airstrikes from Taffy 3's escort carriers did something strategically decisive. They confused Kurita. The Japanese admiral, reading the American aggressiveness, reading the smoke screens, listening to the radio traffic he could not fully decode, concluded that he must be facing something far more substantial than escort carriers and destroyers. He turned. He hesitated. He eventually withdrew. Leyte Gulf was saved not by Halsey's fast carriers, which were 200 miles north, chasing Ozawa's decoy, but by the extraordinary violence of small ships and aircraft crews who attacked forces 10 times their size. It was into this chaos that Carrier Air Wing 80 launched from the Ticonderoga on the morning of October 25th. The USS Ticonderoga, CV-14, was an Essex-class fleet carrier. She had commissioned in May of 1944 and was one of the newest and most capable vessels in the United States Navy. She carried air groups from 3 squadrons: Fighter Squadron VF-80, Bomber Squadron VB-80, and Torpedo Squadron VT-80. On October 25th, all 3 were in the air over Leyte Gulf. George Clements commanded the 2nd section of VT-80's morning strike. He was 26 years old, from Dayton, Ohio, where his father had worked as a machinist at the Frigidaire plant. He had earned his wings at Corpus Christi Naval Air Station in June of 1943 and had flown the TBF Avenger, the Grumman torpedo bomber that the Navy had standardized on after the catastrophic losses of the Douglas Devastator at Midway since his first operational posting. The Avenger was not an elegant aircraft. It was large, heavy, and somewhat ungainly on the ground. Its landing gear retraction was slow enough that it looked, from outside the cockpit, like an aircraft that had briefly forgotten what it was doing. But it was rugged in a way that working tools are rugged, designed for punishment, capable of absorbing damage that would have destroyed more refined machines. It carried its torpedo internally, in a ventral bomb bay that opened downward, which gave a cleaner aerodynamic profile on approach than earlier carrier torpedo bombers. Maximum speed was approximately 260 miles per hour at altitude, at wave-top height, running in for a torpedo drop. Pilots flew considerably slower. Target speed for release was around 200 knots, low and straight, a run that exposed them to every anti-aircraft weapon the target could bring to bear. Clements had made 6 previous torpedo runs. He had never had a guaranteed hit. Torpedo bombing in 1944 was a matter of statistics and nerve rather than precision. The weapon ran shallow for a few hundred yards before finding its depth, and a great many things could go wrong between the moment of release and the moment of impact, if there was a moment of impact at all. On the morning of October 25th, his flight of 3 Avengers joined a coordinated strike being assembled above the fleet. The primary targets were the remnants of Kurita's center force, which had been located northwest of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese formation was already in some disarray from earlier strikes and from the destroyer attacks of Taffy 3. The Musashi, one of the 2 largest battleships ever built, displacing 72,000 tons fully loaded, had been sunk the previous day after absorbing what post-war analysis would count as 17 bomb and 19 torpedo hits. She went down bow first in the sea beyond sea with over 1,000 men. The ships that remained were still formidable. Kurita's withdrawal was not a rout. It was a tactical withdrawal by a force that still included the Yamato, still fully operational, her 18.1-inch guns capable of firing a 3,000-pound shell to a range of 26 miles. Clements was not assigned to attack the Yamato. He was assigned to an attack group targeting the screening destroyers, the vessels whose job was to defend the capital ships from exactly the kind of low, slow, torpedo-dropping aircraft he was flying. His section leader was Lieutenant Franklin Owens. The three Avengers crossed the outer picket line at 10,000 feet, then dropped toward the wave tops for their attack run. The Japanese anti-aircraft response was immediate and heavy. The destroyers of Kurita's screen had been in action since dawn. They were alert, their crews at general quarters, their guns tracking incoming aircraft by radar and by sight. The 20mm and 25mm guns aboard a Japanese destroyer could generate a wall of explosive fragments at low altitude that made a torpedo approach feel less like flying and more like threading a needle through fire. Owens' aircraft was hit first. A direct strike on the engine that left him trailing black smoke as he climbed away from the attack. He released his torpedo before breaking off. Whether it ran true, Clements could not see. Then it was Clements' turn. The 20mm shell entered through the port wing root at the moment he began his final straightening for release. He felt the impact as a physical blow, a concussion through the airframe, and then the hydraulic pressure gauge of the bomb bay dropped to zero. The bay doors may or may not have opened before the line was severed. He could not confirm from the cockpit. He pressed the release anyway, felt what might have been a slight upward pitch that sometimes came with torpedo separation, and pulled hard left to break away from the gun line. Behind him, Roy Dempsey stopped responding on the intercom. The destroyer Clements had attacked was the Fujinami. She was a Yugimo-class destroyer, commissioned in 1942, displacing approximately 2,000 tons fully loaded. She was 390 feet long, armed with 6 Type 3 long lance torpedo tubes and 3 twin 5-inch gun mounts. She was fast, rated for 35 knots in trials, though operational condition and the fuel state of the Japanese Navy in late 1944 made that theoretical figure somewhat academic. She had been part of Kurita's screen throughout the transit of the Sibuyan Sea and the surface action off Samar, and she had survived both. By mid-morning on October 25th, with Kurita's withdrawal underway, the Fujinami had taken on survivors from the cruiser Chokai, which had been disabled and scuttled earlier that morning. She was carrying those survivors, approximately 400 men crowded onto a destroyer built for a crew of 228 when Clements began his approach. Whether Clements' torpedo, released from a bay with several hydraulics and unknown door status, actually ran true has never been definitively established by American records. What is established is what happened next, and it is established in multiple independent sources. The Fujinami was struck by at least one aerial torpedo at approximately 10:43 in the morning of October 25, 1944. The hit detonated in the forward engineering spaces. Within minutes, some accounts say as few as 4, she broke apart. The long lance torpedoes she was carrying cooked off in the secondary explosions. The forward magazine detonated. She sank so rapidly that there was almost no time for any organized abandonment. Of the roughly 620 men aboard, her crew and survivors she had rescued from the Chokai, the post-war record of rescued survivors numbers fewer than 10. She took down not only her own crew, but the men she had stopped to save. Clements, meanwhile, was fighting to keep his aircraft airborne. The TBF behind him had lost hydraulic pressure, not only to the bomb bay, but increasingly to his control surfaces. The port aileron was responding sluggishly. The aircraft was developing a tendency to roll left that required constant right stick input to correct. He climbed to 3,000 feet, got above the worst of the anti-aircraft fire, and began the navigation problem of finding a carrier that was itself moving at high speed through an active combat zone. He keyed his radio. Static. He switched frequencies. More static. The radio hit, or some secondary effect of it, had taken out his transmitter. He could hear fragments of voice traffic, the squeal of fighter direction circuits, the controlled urgency of pilots calling targets and positions. But he could not reply. Dempsey was still not answering. Clements made a decision that his after-action report, written 3 days later, describes with characteristic brevity. He turned toward where the carriers had been and kept flying. The Ticonderoga found him first. A combat air patrol Hellcat spotted the lone Avenger flying a slightly erratic course at low altitude, identified its tail markings, and led it back to the fleet like a shepherd bringing in a stray. Clements made one pass over the Ticonderoga to signal his hydraulic situation, a standard waggle and circuit that the LSO, the landing signal officer, recognized, and was directed to attempt a straight-in approach. He landed aboard on the first attempt. The tailhook caught the third wire. The plane captain who opened the rear turret hatch found Roy Dempsey alive. He had been knocked unconscious by a piece of shrapnel that had entered through the turret's plexiglass, creased his helmet, and embedded itself in the turret wall 6 inches from his face. He woke up as they were lifting him out, looked around at the flight deck of the Ticonderoga, and said something that his plane captain would recall in a post-war interview as unprintable but positive. Clements climbed down from the cockpit, stood on the flight deck for a moment, and then walked to the ship's island to file his report. It was 11:22 in the morning. He had been airborne for 4 hours and 17 minutes. The question of whether Clements' torpedo actually sank the Fujinami is the kind of question that Pacific War historians have been arguing about in various forms since the 1960s, because the Battle of Leyte Gulf involved so many aircraft and ships and overlapping strikes that establishing definitive credit for any individual sinking is genuinely difficult. What the record shows is this. The Fujinami was attacked by aircraft from multiple American carriers during the morning of October 25th. She was confirmed sunk at approximately 10:45, 2 minutes after the time Clements recorded his torpedo release. The strike reports of other Ticonderoga crews do not record attacks on the Fujinami at that time. The nearest other American aircraft in the area were 2 Hellcats providing top cover, whose pilots subsequently reported watching a destroyer break apart below them, following what one of them described as a single torpedo wake running true from an Avenger pulling off its attack. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Hellcat pilot's name was Lieutenant Junior Grade Paul Hendricks of Fighter Squadron 80. His observation report, filed that evening, reads in the relevant portion: Observed TBF, tail number obscured, complete attack run on DD northeast of our position. Single fish appeared to run hot, straight, and normal. Hit observed forward amidships. Destroyer broken 2. Total time from hit to sinking approximately 4 to 5 minutes. TBF broke left after release, appeared at controlled difficulties, climbed away to southeast. The controlled difficulties Hendricks observed were the hydraulic failure that Clements had been managing since the 20mm hit. The fact that the torpedo appeared, to Hendricks' eye, to run hot, straight, and normal suggests that despite the severed hydraulic line, the bay doors had either opened fully before the line was cut or had been forced open by the torpedo's weight as it released. Clements himself was not certain. His after-action report states, released torpedo on standard attack heading at estimated range of 800 yards. Could not confirm bay door status due to hydraulic failure. Aircraft was then unable to observe torpedo run due to evasive maneuver requirements. He did not claim the kill in his report. He described the attack. He described the damage to his aircraft. He described Dempsey's condition. He noted that he had been unable to confirm the torpedo's performance. The intelligence officer who reviewed the report, Lieutenant Commander Harold Foss, noted in the margin, in handwriting that still survives in the action report files, Fujinami sunk approximate 10:43. This is probably it. The Fujinami's sinking matters within the larger context of Leyte Gulf not because one destroyer sunk changed the strategic outcome. The outcome was already being determined by Kurita's withdrawal and Ozawa's destruction to the north, but because of what she was carrying when she went down. The 400 survivors from the Chokai, whom she had rescued that morning, represented a significant fraction of the crew of a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser. They were experienced men, sailors who had been fighting since the earliest days of the Pacific War. The Chokai had been at Pearl Harbor, not as an attacker but as an escort. She had fought at Savo Island in 1942, where Japanese cruisers had inflicted the worst defeat on the United States Navy since the War of 1812. She had survived 2 years of some of the most brutal naval fighting in history before being abandoned off Samar on October 25, 1944. Her survivors were aboard the Fujinami for less than 2 hours before the destroyer went down. The number who survived the Fujinami's sinking is recorded in Japanese post-war records as 7. 7 men, from a combined complement of approximately 620, were recovered from the water. The Chokai survivors, men who had already survived the sinking of one ship that morning, almost universally did not survive the sinking of the second. This is a dimension of the loss that does not appear in the tactical summaries. The statistics show one destroyer sunk, but human arithmetic is considerably more complicated. Back aboard the Ticonderoga, Clements spent 40 minutes with the intelligence officer, and then went to see Dempsey in the ship's medical bay. The turret gunner had a concussion and a scalp laceration that required 8 stitches. He would be back on flight status within a week. The Avenger that Clements had flown that day, bureau number obscured in several archival records, but cross-referenced to the Ticonderoga's maintenance logs as TBF-1C serial number 2449, was surveyed by the ship's aviation maintenance department and determined to be reparable. The hydraulic system was rebuilt over 3 days. The wing root received a metal patch. The radio was replaced. The aircraft flew again before the end of October. Clements flew it on November 9th, on a strike against Japanese shipping off Luzon. He did not sink anything on that mission. He flew 22 more combat missions between October 25, 1944, and he ended his combat tour in February 1945. He was awarded the Navy Cross of the October 25th mission, the citation referencing conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action and noting the hydraulic failure and radio loss without specifying the outcome of the torpedo run, which the Navy considered probable but not absolutely confirmed. He never received formal credit for sinking the Fujinami. In the accounting of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, fought across roughly 100,000 square miles of ocean over 4 days in October 1944, the Fujinami is listed as sunk by aircraft from Task Force 38. The specific aircraft, the specific pilot, the specific torpedo are not part of the official record. This is not unusual. In the chaos of Leyte Gulf, where hundreds of aircraft from dozens of carriers conducted overlapping strikes against a dispersed and moving enemy fleet, definitive individual attribution for many sinkings was impossible to establish with absolute certainty. The accountants of naval history work with what they had: after-action reports, survivor testimonies, aircraft track records, and the physical evidence of wrecks that in many cases lie in water too deep to inspect. The Fujinami lies in the sea beyond sea in approximately 1,200 feet of water. She has not been surveyed. George Clements returned to the United States in March 1945. He was 27 years old. He had flown 23 combat missions in the Pacific, survived a hydraulic failure and a radio blackout over the most heavily defended naval formation Japan could still assemble, and had, in all probability, though never officially confirmed, sent 600 men to bottom of the sea beyond sea with a single torpedo released from a bay whose doors he could not verify were open. He did not talk about it much. His service record shows a posting to Naval Air Station Jacksonville as an instrument flight instructor from April 1945 through the end of the war. He taught young pilots how to fly on instruments alone, how to trust gauges over instinct, how to navigate when the sky closed in and there was nothing outside the cockpit but gray. It was precise, methodical work, the kind that suited a man who had learned over the Philippine Sea that survival required making correct decisions with incomplete information and no time to reconsider. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Clements did not request a regular commission. He left the Navy in October that year, went back to Dayton, and enrolled at Ohio State University on the GI Bill. He graduated in 1949 with a degree in mechanical engineering. He worked for 31 years at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base Complex, not flying, but in the engineering divisions that evaluated aircraft systems, hydraulic components in particular. If there was any private irony in this, a man whose combat career pivoted on a hydraulic failure, spending 3 decades studying hydraulic systems. Clements apparently never remarked on it publicly. His colleagues at Wright-Patterson knew he had flown in the Pacific. Most did not know the specifics. He was not the kind of man who volunteered specifics. Roy Dempsey, the turret gunner who had been knocked unconscious by shrapnel over the Philippine Sea, went home to Mobile, Alabama after the war and opened a hardware store. He and Clements exchanged Christmas cards for decades. Dempsey's daughter, in a brief interview published in an Alabama community newspaper in 2001, recalled that her father had spoken to Clements with particular quality of regard that she described as the way you talk about someone who pulled you out of a fire. She said her father had visited Clements in Dayton twice, in 1962 and again in 1978, and at both times they had sat on the porch and talked for hours about things she was not part of and could not entirely follow. She remembered one thing her father had said after the second visit. He had told her that Clements always figured the torpedo ran true, but he never said it as a fact, because he hadn't seen it himself. That discipline, the insistence on the boundary between what he knew and what he believed, is consistent with everything in Clements' official record. His after-action report from October 25, 1944, is a model of precise, unembellished military writing. He described what he saw, what he did, what he could confirm, and nothing more. The intelligence officer's marginal note. Fujinami sunk approximate 1043. This is probably it. Represents more interpretive confidence than Clements himself ever committed to paper. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, taken as a whole, was settled in America's favor by an accumulation of decisions and accidents and acts of violence that no single person planned or controlled. Halsey's pursuit of Ozawa was a strategic error that nearly allowed Kurita to reach the transports at Leyte Beach. But Kurita's own hesitation, his decision to turn away from the disintegrating Taffy 3, when he was within range of MacArthur's helpless supply ships, was an equally consequential failure of nerve at the critical moment. The Japanese lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers in 4 days. The United States lost 3 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, and approximately 3,000 men. American naval power in the Pacific was never again seriously contested after October 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy as a coherent strategic force ceased to exist. Within this enormous arithmetic, the Fujinami is a minor entry, but she is not a trivial one, because of what her loss illustrates about the particular economics of naval warfare in the Pacific in those final years. The Japanese fleet in 1944 was not only fighting against superior American numbers and production capacity, it was fighting against a system, the American industrial and logistical machinery, that could absorb losses and regenerate them faster than any human decision-making process could track. Japan could not. Every experienced sailor who went down with the Fujinami was irreplaceable in a way that his American counterpart, at that stage of the war, was not. The United States was commissioning new Essex-class carriers at a rate that made individual ship losses painful but not strategically decisive. Japan was struggling to keep its remaining carriers supplied with aviation fuel and trained pilots. The human capital aboard the Fujinami, men who had been fighting since 1941 and 1942, who knew the old equipment and the old tactics and the specific demands of sustained naval warfare, was capital Japan could not reconstitute. The choke-eye survivors she was carrying made this calculus even starker. These were men who had fought at Savo Island, who had survived the carnage of the slot in the waters around Guadalcanal, who represented years of accumulated combat experience. In a navy that had been bleeding trained men since Midway, they were not easily replaced. They were in the water for less than 5 minutes before the Fujinami was gone. The wreck of the Fujinami has attracted less attention from maritime historians and divers than many of the other vessels lost at Leyte Gulf, partly because of her depth. 1,200 feet places her well beyond the reach of recreational diving, and partly because she is overshadowed in historical literature by the larger and more dramatically significant losses of the battleships Musashi and Fuso and Yamashiro, and by the carrier Zukaku, the last surviving ship from the Pearl Harbor strike force, which went down under air attack to the north on the same day. The Musashi was located in 2017 by a research expedition funded by Paul Allen. Her wreck sits in roughly 3,300 feet of water in the sea beyond sea, and the photographs from the expedition, showing the enormous anchor chains, the massive gun turrets, the scale of a vessel that was simply too large for the era that produced her, circulated widely. The Zuikaku, the Fuso, the Yamashiro have all entered the popular historical consciousness as landmarks of that battle. The Fujinami is at 1,200 feet, theoretically accessible to deep water survey vehicles. She has not, as of the time of this writing, been located or formally identified on the seafloor. She is a notation in the official loss records. Destroyer Yugimo class, sunk by aircraft, 25th of October 1944. What is known about her final minutes comes primarily from the 7 survivors, 7 men out of 620, who were recovered from the water and who survived the war to give testimony to Japanese naval historians in the post-war period. Their accounts describe a ship that died very quickly. The torpedo hit. They describe a single explosion forward, followed almost immediately by the secondary detonations of their own torpedoes and ammunition, left almost no time for organized response. The ship broke in two within 3 minutes. Those who survived did so because they were on deck and were thrown clear by the explosion rather than trapped below. The survivors of the Chokai crowded onto a deck they were unfamiliar with, without access to the Fujinami survival equipment, had almost no chance. One survivor, Petty Officer Second Class Hiroshi Tanaka of the Fujinami's crew, gave a detailed account to the Japanese Defense Agency's War History Division in 1963. He described the torpedo strike as coming from the starboard side, forward, at approximately the location of the forward boiler room. He described the ship lifting momentarily from a force of the secondary explosions. He described being in the water and watching the two halves of his ship sink separately, the stern taking longer than the bow. He described trying to help a survivor of the Chokai, who could not swim. He was not able to help him. Tanaka's account ends there, with a single sentence. I could not hold him, and the water was moving too fast. He does not know the man's name. He does not know which ship he served on, though context implies a Chokai. He describes him only as a man about 40 years old, with a burn on his right hand. These are the granular human realities that the operational summaries cannot contain. The official record shows 613 men lost. Tanaka's testimony preserves one of them, nameless, 40 years old, a burn on his right hand, for as long as anyone reads it. George Clements died in Dayton, Ohio, in September 1991. He was 73 years old. He had been retired from Wright-Patterson since 1980, and had spent his last decade tending a large garden behind the house he had shared with his wife, Eleanor, since 1953. He had 2 sons, both engineers. He had 4 grandchildren. He had, by all accounts, a quiet and satisfying life in a city that had been shaped, like his own career, by the demands and legacies of American air power. His obituary in the Dayton Daily News described him as a veteran of the Pacific War and a retired aerospace engineer. It mentioned the Navy Cross. It did not mention Fujinami. His Navy Cross citation, which is part of the public record, describes the October 25th mission in language that is both accurate and somehow insufficient. Lieutenant Commander Clements, despite severe damage to his aircraft and loss of radio communications, pressed home his attack against heavily defended enemy surface forces with determination and skill, delivering his weapon under conditions of extreme difficulty. The weapon is the torpedo. The heavily defended enemy surface forces includes a Fujinami. The extreme difficulty encompasses a hydraulic failure, the silent turret gunner, the radio static, and the approach into a wall of anti-aircraft fire from a formation of warships that have been in action since before dawn. What the citation does not say, because citations do not speak this way, is what it means to fly a crippled aircraft toward a target you may or may not be able to hit with a weapon you may or may not be able to release, while a man behind you does not answer when you speak to him, and the only information you have about what is possible comes from what you have already decided to do. That knowledge, the knowledge of what you are capable of in the moments when capability is required, is not something that transfers easily to paper. The Battle of Leyte Gulf is remembered, when it is remembered at all by the general public, through a handful of iconic images and stories. The Yamato, bristling with guns, steaming toward her final destruction. Halsey chasing the decoy carriers north, leaving the door open. The tin cans of taffy, 3 charging into the guns of the Japanese battle line. These are the stories that have made it into the films and the popular histories, and they deserve their place there. They are genuinely extraordinary. But Leyte Gulf was also made of smaller moments, less photographed and less sung, in which individual men made individual decisions under conditions where the consequences of error were absolute and immediate. The pilots of strike aircraft operated at the intersection of physics and violence in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct from the official record. They flew into anti-aircraft fire at low altitude because the geometry of torpedo attack demanded it. They accepted the statistical reality that some fraction of every strike would not return. Clements returned. He landed aboard, filed his report, visited his gunner in the medical bay, and went to sleep in his bunk. The next morning, he was in the briefing room for the day's operations. This is not heroism in the theatrical sense. It is something quieter and, in some ways, more demanding. The willingness to continue performing a function when the function has demonstrated its cost with great clarity. The Fujinami had been in the Imperial Japanese Navy for 2 years and 4 months when she was sunk on October 25, 1944. In those 2 years, she had participated in operations across the breadth of the Pacific Theater, from the waters around Truk to the South China Sea, from the Solomon's Campaign to the final desperate gamble of Shogo I. She was not a famous ship. She was a working destroyer, assigned to screen duty and escort work and 1,000 routine tasks of fleet operations that make it possible for larger vessels to function. She was, in the end, sunk by a torpedo from an aircraft whose pilot was not certain the torpedo had released cleanly, whose turret gunner was unconscious, and whose radio produced nothing but static. The war did not pause to notice. The strike reports were filed. The intelligence summaries were compiled. The fleet moved on toward Luzon, toward Iwo Jima, toward Okinawa, toward the home islands themselves. The operational tempo of the Pacific War in its final year was such that even a battle as enormous as Leyte Gulf was processed and absorbed within weeks, its lessons extracted and incorporated, its dead counted and mourned and moved past. The 7 survivors of the Fujinami were eventually repatriated to Japan after the surrender. They returned to a country that was processing the meaning of total defeat in real time, that was dismantling the structures and doctrines that produced both the carrier strike on Pearl Harbor and the catastrophe of Leyte Gulf. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a legal institution in November 1945. The ships, the ranks, the traditions formally abolished. Hiroshi Tanaka, the petty officer whose account preserved the nameless man with the burned hand, became a fisherman after the war. He fished the same waters in which he had nearly drowned. He lived until 1987. He gave his account to naval historians in 1963 and was not, as far as the available record shows, interviewed again. What remains, after all of it, after the operational summaries and the intelligence reports and the archival marginalia and the brief lives documented in obituaries and interview transcripts, is the central image that this story returns to. A man flying a broken aircraft toward a target, uncertain whether his weapon will release, uncertain whether his crewman is alive, out of communication with his ship and his formation, making decisions that cannot be undone in a space of time measured in seconds. He pressed a release. The torpedo, if Hendrick's observation is credited, ran true. 600 men went into the Philippine Sea. 7 came out. Clements filed his report and slept in his bunk. Dempsey woke up with 8 stitches and an unprintable opinion about his survival. The Fujinami settled into the silt of the sea beyond sea, where she remains. And Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in recorded history, fought across 100,000 square miles of ocean in the last week of October 1944, closed its accounts and was entered into the record as an American victory, decisive and complete. It was decisive and complete. But it was assembled, like all such victories, from the accumulated weight of individual moments of decision and violence and survival and loss, each one unremarkable by itself, each one essential to the arithmetic of the whole. Clement's moment lasted 40 seconds, from the beginning of his final attack run to the breakaway. He could not see what happened after. He carried that uncertainty home to Dayton, to Wright-Patterson, to his garden, to the end of his life. He knew what he had done. He could not know what it had meant. That is a condition of almost everyone who fights in a war. You act within the limits of what you can see and know, and decide in the time available. The rest, the consequences you cannot observe, the men in the water you will never name, the wreck settling into darkness 1,200 feet below the Philippine Sea, belongs to history, which records what it can and loses the rest of time in depth and silence. October 25, 1944. A pilot released a torpedo from a broken aircraft over a sea already full of burning ships and dying men. Somewhere in the sea beyond sea, the answer to what happened next has been resting in 1,200 feet of water for 80 years. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.